Welcome to Get to the Hook. I'm your host, Eric Colley, joined today by a special guest, Derek Kaufman from the Last Days podcast.
Filling in for Charles today.
Yeah,
so you're going to get some real learning out there today.
That's right. Actually, I'm glad you're here for this because it's the inauguration week. We've seen all the concerts happening in Washington, and we are going to get into the inaugural balls of the presidents. And this is not going to be political, so don't worry about, wanting to tune out if you don't want the politics. We are just talking about the performances. If we mention the politics, it's only the relationship between the president and the artist. But we're not going to get political today. That's not the point of this. We're just talking about the music. And you have named both of your children after presidents.
I named them both.
So you are the perfect person.
I am the perfect person to be here. Look, this, aside from the concert that's upcoming for the LA Fires, this is the music event of the day. And so we have to talk about it. I mean, the inauguration has a lot of media attention, and it's a very celebratory mood for some. As you said, we're not going to be political here, but the idea of all of these rallies and all of these victory parties is to amp up the crowd. And what better way to do that than with music?
It's a celebration coming off of a year-long campaign for every president, no matter who wins, whatever happens. It's been a grueling year, an election year. They always are. So this is the celebration at the end of it. And the song of the inauguration this year is this song, YMCA. Donald Trump loves that song.
Can I tell you something? Look, he is a divisive figure. There's no two ways about it. But that song, when it came on, both our heads were bopping and both of us smiled. It's impossible. It's one of the most overplayed songs. If you've ever been to a wedding, and yet it's infectious. And it's a bop.
Great song.
It is.
It just genuinely is. So the Village People performed at Trump's inauguration.
One original, right?
One original member, Victor Willis, who was the lead singer. So that's, if you're going to have one, that's the one you'd want.
Guy. The cop, correct?
He was a cop, and sometimes I think he was not the army man. He wasn't always a cop. I forget what his other one was. Maybe the military guy.
Yeah,
I don't know.
But not the man in the full Native American head.
No.
Although they
he's
still
not
have
part
him
of
on
this.
stage.
They have somebody playing that character now. Yes, it's not the original guy. So yeah, we're going to go through quickly the history of these inaugurations. It's fascinating. First, I got to thank my friend Brad. This was his idea. He listens to this show, so he texted me and he goes, "You should do an episode about inaugural concerts." I'm like, "That is a good idea."
It's a good idea,
thanks, Brad.
Check out the big brain on Brad.
Big brain Brad, that's what we call him. It's interesting. I didn't really know the history of this. So obviously inaugurations are as old as the presidency because you have to swear in whoever wins. When George Washington showed up to his, it was the very first one, there was a military parade that greeted him, which makes sense.
Sure.
The first entertainment-focused inauguration came earlier than you might think. It was for James Madison in 1809.
That's much earlier than I would think. I was going to say the 20s or 30s. I know there was a vice president who had a number one hit song.
Yeah, wrote a number one hit. It's all in the game.
Wow.
It was. You remember at the Super Bowl, before Michael Jackson did the Super Bowl in 93 and kickstarted that era of Super Bowl superstar halftime shows. You remember Up With People?
Of course I do.
It was this group of like dancing, singing, happy people that wanted everyone to feel good. I think this is the 19th century version of Up With People. It was a group called the Washington Dancing Assembly.
Love it.
And they were a group of men who danced and performed for Washington socialites, and they performed for James and Dolly Madison in 1809. It was the first time there was actual outside entertainment booked for an inauguration.
I'm assuming you can't throw to a clip of this?
No, we got no clips of that.
From the early 19th century?
But you're right. Our idea of kind of the modern inauguration with celebrities, you got to jump way forward, 1941.
Okay.
This was Franklin Roosevelt's third inauguration, the only president ever to have 3 and 4 terms. And it makes sense because by the early 40s, you actually have film stars and recorded music stars. You didn't have those really much longer before that. So you had Irving Berlin, not someone doing one of his songs. You had actual Irving Berlin performing God Bless America.
That's incredible.
Mickey Rooney, who was 19 years old at the time, performed. Also, this is cool, Charlie Chaplin performed.
Oh, wow.
So he was 20, 30 years into his career at that point.
Not known for his voice.
No, but the one famous thing he did in the talkies, his movie The Great Dictator, where he played sort of a parody, a satire of Adolf Hitler, while Hitler was still... America had not entered World War II yet in January of 1941. Charlie Chaplin, as this Hitler character, gave this big speech at the end of the movie, and he recreated that at FDR's inauguration.
Oh, that's incredible.
Yeah.
When there was actually the menace of Hitler
Yeah.
looming over the world, he was lampooning it at the inauguration.
Right. Yeah. World War II had started, but this is January of 41. Of course, Pearl Harbor is in December of 41, so America wasn't involved in the war yet.
And now, full circle, Elon Musk is giving the Nazi salute at a rally for Donald Trump. I don't know if people have seen that video.
We're not getting political, Derek.
It's appalling. I don't know.
Okay, you're jumping ahead. One you'll like, 1957. Dwight Eisenhower, his second inauguration, the first black woman to perform at an inauguration. And we have a clip of this one because we're hitting relatively modern times compared to 1809. This is the opera great Marian Anderson. She sang the national anthem. This is her performing in 1957.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light?
Not much has changed, honestly.
It really hasn't. It's an incredibly important moment for civil rights history as well. This is,
of course, years before the civil rights movement really kicked off.
It's an incredible, that's a very famous clip. And, her voice stands up. She was incredible at the time. She's incredible now. And it's a very important piece of history right there.
And we still see a lot of opera singers. Trump had one at his inauguration this week.
He's old school, man. Macchio, right?
Yeah, a lot of presidents have had that. It is interesting also, as we get into this, how many artists have been at multiple inaugurations, and not always for the president you would guess. Because I think you tend to associate politics with certain artists, or at least a political leaning, if nothing else.
Sure.
And some of them performed for presidents you wouldn't have guessed. There's going to be some surprises in this.
Pray tell.
Well, we'll get to those. We're jumping through the years here. 1961, this is an interesting one. This was when John F. Kennedy was inaugurated. And of course, Kennedy was young for a president.
Yeah, a lot of excitement about him. He was seen as more progressive. He came off of Eisenhower, who was an old war general.
But he was also, being in his 40s, was a younger generation than most presidents before him. It was seen as a generational shift, and we'll see a couple of those in this list. And the person who wanted to produce a big inaugural gala for him was Frank Sinatra, who was very involved in the Kennedy campaign. Mm-hmm. Of course, there's the conspiracy theories that Sinatra had the mafia kill Kennedy when he wasn't as involved as he wanted to be. That's a little ridiculous.
Your theories are my facts, but go on.
I don't think Frank Sinatra had the mafia kill Kennedy. That's just something.
My daughter's name is Nixon, so you know where I stand on all Kennedy things. I know you stand on
that. But this is interesting, this one in particular, because it was lost for almost 60 years. So Sinatra in 61 was 20 years into his career, but he was still a very relevant figure in culture and in music. He had more number one hits in the 60s after this. So he had this big thing. He was producing it. NBC was going to air it. And he wanted it deliberately to be multi-ethnic. There were black performers, which was pretty shocking in 1961.
Pretty progressive for the time.
He had Harry Belafonte performed, Nat King Cole, Ella Fitzgerald, also Gene Kelly, Ethel Merman, big stars of that era. A giant blizzard hit Washington because it is January.
Absolutely. It's cold today.
It knocked a lot of power out. So they got some generators up enough to film this. So they were going to tape it, and then NBC was going to air it after the fact. But because of the poor lighting and just the weirdness of it, how they had to do it, NBC decided not to air it.
Oh, wow.
So you have Frank Sinatra, John F. Kennedy, Jackie Kennedy, Nat King Cole, Gene Kelly, all these huge stars, and it got shelved.
Wow.
And PBS finally aired it as a special in 2017. That's how long that footage just sat somewhere in the archives.
And was it lit? Was it like Coachella, Woodstock? What was,
for 1961,
yeah,
for that
that's
crowd,
a lineup right there.
Yeah, it kind of is. They were, celebratory, a little loose, a little happy, and had a good time.
You're right. This was when Sinatra was still relatively young, but deep into his career.
Yeah,
right?
He was decades in, but he still had Strangers in the Night hadn't happened yet. Something Stupid with his daughter Nancy hadn't happened yet.
And he was still cool.
He was still very cool.
Yeah.
And we're going to see him pop up again, producing another one in about 20 years. First, we're going to stop in 1969. You love this one. This is your guy, Richard Nixon. You are the only Richard Nixon stan in the world.
Everyone needs a stan.
This is so bizarre. In 1968, for historical context, you got to remember what a difficult year 1968 was. Vietnam is raging and becoming increasingly unpopular. Who was supposed to be the great hope of the Democrats that year at the election, Bobby Kennedy assassinated, Martin Luther King Jr. assassinated that year. The Summer of Love, psychedelics are hitting America's youth. It was a weird year.
Yeah, the height of the counterculture, and Nixon was not a counterculture
He was
figure.
not.
Yeah.
So the people that performed for Richard Nixon in January of 69, his first inauguration, Connie Francis is there, Tony Bennett, okay. Also, the godfather of soul himself, James Brown, showed up to perform specifically his hit Say it loud. I'm black and I'm proud. And he eventually got the stodgy old white conservatives in the audience to chant along with him, I'm black and I'm proud. Everyone was singing it, except you know who wasn't? Richard Milhouse Nixon.
Yeah.
But there's a reason for that.
He wasn't black and proud?
He wasn't there.
Oh.
He was
even
not
better excuse.
there. Yeah, so Nixon, the Secret Service, kept him in New York because a few months earlier at a James Brown concert, some excited fans smashed some windows. It wasn't like a full riot, but they were worried.
Sure.
And so Richard Nixon was not in attendance. But this did not hurt James Brown's feelings at all because in 1968, James Brown was a Democrat. He voted as a Democrat. In 1972, when Nixon won re-election, James Brown endorsed him.
Interesting.
He did. And there's a photo of James Brown and Richard Nixon shaking hands in the Oval Office. Second place in weirdness to Richard Nixon and Elvis in the Oval Office. But
this is sort of fascinating because there's a little bit of an echo of, Trump spending his second term has been a slightly larger tent of people coming in to support him than the first go around. The first go around was Ted Nugent and Kid Rock.
No, it was Three Doors Down.
That's true. Three doors down.
Performed.
But Nixon in his first term was pretty unpopular. The silent majority and all of this stuff.
It was a really
countercultural moment.
Fraught time.
But the second time he won in a landslide, and more people got on board, including, I did not know that James Brown absolutely endorsed him. Sammy Davis Jr. was a fan of Richard Nixon. So he did sort of reach across. I'm not going to turn this into a Nixon podcast.
You love him so much.
But it's interesting to see someone during their second term reach out a little bit more broadly with their appeal. I'm not sure how that second term went. We won't talk about that.
We won't talk about that Watergate. We're not getting political. 1977, Jimmy Carter, his first and only inauguration. Linda Ronstadt, we have a contemporary pop star performing. She did a cover of Patsy Cline's Crazy, written by Willie Nelson, who famously smoked weed at the White House.
Sure did.
Also, Aretha Franklin performed. It is the first of 3 times we are going to see Aretha Franklin.
When you are the queen of soul, you get to perform multiple times.
Yeah.
I mean, she's as deserving as a person can be. You got Marian Anderson, and she's filling those shoes for later generations.
Which is funny. Jimmy Carter didn't come back to the White House, but Aretha Franklin did.
Come on back.
1981, this is a weird story on this one. Ronald Reagan, his first inauguration. Of course, Reagan at the time, he was 69. He was the oldest elected president until Joe Biden and Trump are now both older than Reagan was.
Isn't that wild? Seems like a spring chicken now.
Well, 69 seemed a lot older in 1981 than it does now.
We aged differently back then.
That's true. It skewed older, not just because of Reagan's age, but he had deep Hollywood connections going back to the 40s. And his inauguration was produced by Frank Sinatra, who was much more conservative in 1981 than he had been in 1961 when he did it for JFK. And you saw a lot of iconic, legendary people, but people who had been Ronald Reagan's friends.
Yes.
So you had these even by 1981, these people had been around 40, 50 years. Dean Martin is there, Bob Hope, Jimmy Stewart, Johnny Carson. Burt Reynolds was the young guy that showed up. The controversial performance was Ben Vereen, of all people.
Interesting.
And if you don't know who Ben Vereen is, he's a legendary Broadway actor. He played the wizard in Wicked, the original Broadway run of that in the 2000s. He was in Roots. In the iconic Fresh Prince of Bel-Air episode where Will Smith says his dad doesn't want him, Ben Vereen played the dad.
Yes.
So if you remember the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, that's how you'd know Ben Vereen.
One of those triple threat guys, right? He could sing,
do everything.
He could dance, he could act. He was incredible.
Yeah. So he performed, he sang in blackface. Now, if you don't know who Ben Vereen is, again, he is black.
He is black.
And so he was performing with a guy named Burt Williams, who had been a black vaudeville performer back in the 1930s, or 50 years before this even. And so Ben Vereen came out in blackface. At the end of his performance, he wipes the makeup off and talks about how in Burt Williams' day, that black artists had to perform in blackface. They had to make themselves into racist caricatures and stereotypes just to be able to get on a stage. So he was trying to make a statement at Ronald Reagan's inauguration about racist stereotypes, but ABC, who broadcast this, edited out the part where he wiped it off and explained why he did it. So they only aired him performing in blackface and then cut it off. So they got tons of complaints from people who were offended by this. And poor Ben Vereen. I don't know that this was the time or place to make that statement just because it's going to get lost, but it was cut off. So nobody knew why he did it at the time.
I wonder what the suits at, what was it, ABC?
It was ABC.
What were they thinking? That this would be less offensive if we just let him perform in blackface and don't let him wipe it off? It boggles the mind to think how they thought this would play.
Or if they thought it was just a timing issue, like, well, we can cut this part out and just show him singing. I don't know.
Yeah.
The footage is out there. It's it's jarring seeing a black man in blackface, but he had a point to doing it, and the person he was trying to honor was there, this Burt Williams.
Yeah.
But it got lost.
What's interesting about Reagan is he was such a Hollywood guy before he became president that
He was president of the Screen Actors Guild.
That's right. I mean, he was fully indoctrinated in sort of glitz and glamour, and his inaugurations are the first ones that, when you pull up on YouTube, really seem like what they are in modern days, right? I mean, they
close, but I think there's one that brings you much closer.
Oh, interesting.
In 1989, George H.W. Bush had a lot of blues artists: Albert Collins, Bo Diddley, Sam Moore from Sam and Dave, who just died recently. He's going to come up again. He performed for Trump in 2017. This is still...
Sam and Dave are Soul Man.
Yeah, Hold On, I'm Coming. Yeah, classic songs. But you have all these older presidents. 1993, Bill Clinton gets elected. He was 46 at the time.
Played the saxophone on Arsenio Hall. Another Kennedy-esque figure.
Yeah, because like Kennedy, it was a generational shift. Even though we are all so tired of boomers now and like wish they would let up on power a little bit, although Biden and Trump are not boomers. They're too old.
Yes.
They're too old to be boomers, actually. They're the generation before. But this, boomers, Clinton was 46. He was young, certainly for a president.
Sure.
And not only was he a younger president like Kennedy had been, but he was the first president to come of age in the rock and roll era.
Mm-hmm.
Most of these other presidents wanted opera singers and blues artists and classical pieces because that's what they grew up with. Clinton pulled off a coup. Well, I don't mean that in a political sense, but a big victory for him at his inauguration. One of the most classic moments at any inauguration. He got Fleetwood Mac to get along and get back together.
One of the most sort of fraught histories in rock music. The Fleetwood Mac, the thought of them getting together in a room was unthinkable, but it took a presidency, a unifying moment.
It did, because all throughout his campaign in '92, he had used Fleetwood Mac's song "Don't Stop," and it kind of helped propel him. It was part of that exciting energy of,
100%.
Finally, like, younger people are coming along. Ronald Reagan was not going to use a Fleetwood Mac song. Yeah. Jimmy Carter wasn't going to.
It feels so boomer now, but you have to
now.
Remember, this was 1992. It didn't feel boomer.
No, that song was only 15 years old when he used it, and it was still Fleetwood Mac. I mean, there's
still Fleetwood Mac.
Gen Z now loves Fleetwood Mac because of the whole, cranberry juice on the skateboard guy that went viral a few years ago. So Fleetwood Mac had not performed together in years at this point, and Lindsey Buckingham did not want to perform. And Stevie Nicks said, "If you don't do this, I will never speak to you again." So Lindsey agreed, and he said,
"I thought he'd be like, promise."
Yeah, I don't, because then they did get back together a few years later. But at that time, they were not in a good place. But the original classic Rumors era lineup got back together. They only performed "Don't Stop," and Lindsey Buckingham said afterward, he's like, "I don't think we could have done more than one song," because they just couldn't stand each other.
The depths of their hatred at that time.
But not only did they get together to do "Don't Stop," who jumps in on guest vocals? Michael Jackson.
Amazing.
So this is a little clip of that performance. I mean, and also, again, for context, this is January of '93. Michael's first child abuse allegations didn't come out until a few months later. So this was still primetime king of pop, unquestioned Michael Jackson.
100%.
Also, he performed at that inauguration, and he performed his song "Gone Too Soon," which was for Ryan White, who died of AIDS as a child. It's the first and only time he ever performed that song live. Wow. He also did "Heal the World." So, we were saying Michael Jackson kind of transformed the Super Bowl halftime show in 1993. The month before, he did the same thing for inaugurations, because this is the first time you see A-list, massive, current, relevant pop stars, not just icons and legends, but people who are hot in the moment.
Yeah.
Also, at the inauguration festivities, Aretha Franklin shows up again. It's her second. Barbra Streisand, Elton John, Michael Bolton, who was very hot in 1993. LL Cool J.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure he must have been the first rapper to ever appear it might be the last one, actually. I'm trying to think. Oh, no. Trump had Snoop and Nelly this year.
Snoop and Nelly. They're usually a reflection of the sensibilities of the president or the mood of the country. It's interesting, Michael Bolton's there. They also reflect sort of broad-based appeal. That's what I usually think of inaugurations. You're not going to have a very offensive artist. You're not going to have Tupac and Biggie in.
No, NWA was not going to show up. For
NWA is not going to be there, but you're going to have the King of Pop maybe, and they're interesting time capsules because they're a reflection of what did everyone who was sort of milquetoast and lame think of entertainment.
Right.
Watch the inauguration. You'll often get a good section of it.
One of the most youth-centric, surprisingly current inaugurations ever happened in 2001 for George W. Bush's first inauguration, mostly at the insistence of his daughters, the Bush twins, Jenna and
Barbara.
Yes, and they had their favorite artists, and W was like, okay.
Yeah.
So it was called the Inaugural Concert Celebrating America's Youth, and performers included 98 Degrees, Jessica Simpson, who was dating Nick Lachey from 98 Degrees at that time. Jessica Simpson performed her song, I Think I'm in Love with You. And you remember the chorus of that song? She was, Boy, I Think I'm in Love with You.
Mm-hmm.
She changed it to, George, I Think I'm in Love with You. It's not aged well.
I love it.
Also, you know who else performed at that concert? Destiny's Child. This is Beyonce's first inauguration appearance. She's so iconic for performing at Obama's when she did At Last and these other songs. She's done 3 of them now, and one of them was George W. Bush's.
See, what's interesting is that was a very contentious election. Obviously, 2000 had Bush v. Gore. This
Hanging
was
Chads, the whole thing.
Hanging Chads, the whole thing. Beyonce, a little bit like, there's a famous story about Michael Jordan said, I don't get political because I want to sell shoes to Republicans as well. Beyonce has a little of that in her as well. She's from Texas. She wants to sell a lot of albums.
I don't think she would. I can't imagine a circumstance where she would perform for Donald Trump.
That's true. I think he's too polarized. It also reminds you who George W. Bush is and how he's sort of aged. The fact that he did it for his daughters, when he was at the inauguration today, he seems like a fun dad. He's obviously a very sort of controversial political figure, although he seems quaint by today's standards of politics. But it's interesting that he was like, I'll let my daughters run this. It'll make me seem cool and hip. And it just reflects what teenagers were into at that moment.
That performance, that inauguration, did see one artist who has come out and regretted performing at an inauguration. You don't usually see that.
You don't hear that often.
Like, I don't think Beyonce, as far as I know, and I could be wrong about this, I don't know that she's ever said, I regret performing at that. Ricky Martin performed in 2001. And then in 2007, he was doing a concert in San Juan and mentioned, he had a lyric that referenced George Bush, and he held up his middle finger. And people were outraged about this, and he defended it, and he said, I will always condemn war and those who promulgate it.
Good for him.
Yeah.
I mean,
He's
listen.
like, my views on him have changed on George Bush, and he spoke what was true for him in 2007.
Yeah, it's interesting. George Bush came into office, and he was one political figure, and then he served a term, and people got different assessments of him after 9/11 and what he did with the country and the wars he started.
He was very popular after that, but yeah, the country
not with everyone.
So polarized. Also, at George W. Bush's first inauguration, Lee Greenwood saying, God bless the USA. It's like Republican presidents just keep Lee Greenwood in mothballs until their inauguration. Trump used him at both of his to come out and sing, God bless the USA.
It is one of the sturdiest political anthems of the 20th and 21st century, right?
It came out in 1984. That song is older than you. It's over 40 years old now.
And it's just omnipresent. I just think
and
of Blue Angels
flying
over.
Yeah. 2009, Obama's first inauguration was a very star-studded, probably the biggest one we've seen so far, maybe ever. Beyonce sang the national anthem. Other performers there, Aretha Franklin, her third and final. Bruce Springsteen, Mary J. Blige, John Bon Jovi, John Mellencamp, James Taylor, Shakira, U2, Usher, will.i.am, Stevie Wonder. Then, interestingly, they had a 2009, the Youth Ball. It was a separate inaugural event because there's a lot of concerts. It's not all one event.
And there was so much excitement for Obama that he could have multiple events with
So he had this Youth Ball for younger acts featuring somebody that did not vote for him. He had Fall Out Boy perform, Kanye West performed, and Kid Rock.
Mm-hmm. Who has pointed this out recently when Michelle Obama decided not to attend Trump's inauguration festivities. He said, well, I performed for Obama and I didn't vote for him, trying to seem magnanimous. I'm not sure it quite works or it's quite analogous. But
his point is true. Like, as we said, James Brown did not vote for Richard Nixon in 1968, but performed in 69.
It's an honor to be asked to perform for a president.
And that's what kind of the Village people have said now about Trump, and what Nelly said. People came after Nelly, and he just said, I would perform for anybody. He goes, if Biden was reelected, I would perform. If Kamala had won, I'd perform. He goes, to me, it's an honor to perform for the office.
That's right.
He goes, I'm not a political person. He goes, I'm clueless about those kind of things. Do not take your voting advice from me. It was just something that meant something to him to be able to perform for the president at the inauguration.
There's something to that. I mean, look, he won the election. It's obviously a very polarizing issue. He's very divisive, but he is now everyone's president. That's the way things work in politics in the United States, or used to. And it used to be like, now you're the president for everyone, and you hope he'll step up to the office and run in a dignified fashion.
And I think even whatever happens, nobody shames James Brown for performing for Richard Nixon.
Not at all.
I don't think the right is mad at Kid Rock for performing for Obama. There's something about performing for a president. And yeah, when I started doing this, I wouldn't have thought Beyonce performed for George Bush and Kid Rock performed for Obama. Sometimes you just want to perform.
Is your memory so when Obama was elected, I was 28. We're roughly the same age. You're a little older. That seemed like the coolest inauguration I had ever seen in terms of the lineup. It just reflected sort of respect for history. You had the Aretha Franklins, but you also had modern acts.
Fall Out Boy and James Taylor, who showed up again in 2013 when Obama got reelected. Beyonce came back and sang At Last, which really ticked off Etta James, who sang it in the 60s, and she was not happy about Beyonce taking her song, which, no disrespect to Etta James, who has passed now, it wasn't her song either.
That's true.
Glenn Miller and his orchestra did it in the 1940s, but
it's like
the iconic version is Etta James. That is her song. She
look,
owns
Sinead O'Connor's "Nothing Compares to You" wasn't her song,
Whitney
but
Houston's
it's
"I Will
her
Always
song.
Love You" sometimes. So she performed Aretha Franklin, we said, Stevie Wonder, Usher, James Taylor, Jamie Foxx, Chris Cornell, Smokey Robinson, Katy Perry, John Legend, Brad Paisley, Nick Cannon, the Far East Movement, the Like a G6 group performed. Fun. Remember Fun?
I remember Fun.
In 2012, they were huge with We Are Young.
That's right. And now
that got them booked in 2013, and now
one of the biggest producers is a member of Fun, right?
Yeah, Jack Antonoff is Taylor Swift's producer, and Sabrina Carpenter. So he got to perform at Obama's 2013 inauguration. Trump's 2017 inauguration was an odd one. It was a very divisive election.
It was an odd time in the country.
Yeah. Supposedly, Elton John was asked and declined. Some people say that he was never asked. I don't know. But we know who did appear. Toby Keith was there. I would imagine, were he still alive, probably would have been at Trump's 2025 inauguration.
I'd imagine, although his politics were a little more complicated
I think he was a registered Democrat in Oklahoma, actually. But Toby Keith performed for Trump. Again, Sam Moore, who had performed for George H.W. Bush in '89, came back. Three Doors Down was a surprising choice.
Yeah, there was a palpable sense with Trump's first term that he got who he could get, who was willing to perform, because Three Doors Down was already a bunch of has-beens at that point.
It's harsh on Three Doors Down, but
at that point they were. I mean, and
they were 15 years past their 10-15 years past their heyday.
It seemed like he couldn't get the acts that he wanted to perform for him, and that's the way it sort of sometimes feels with Trump. Less so this time.
Who he would have wanted, because this year we have Carrie Underwood performed, had to sing a cappella. Very professional of her. There was supposed to be a choir performing with her, or a chorus and a backing track. Neither of those things happened, and she just sang it a cappella on the spot.
She had a real moment. I mean, she
sounded
American.
great.
She's performed under pressure many times.
Jason Aldean, Snoop Dogg, Gavin DeGraw at Trump's 2025 inauguration. I don't think Trump listens to any of those artists. I don't think he really likes music, honestly. I don't get the impression he's a music guy.
I don't think
other than YMCA for some reason.
It's hard to imagine him having a musical soul or something. Like it's not.
And again, not being political,
aside.
that is not a knock on Donald Trump, because Joe Biden's inauguration in 21 had Lady Gaga, Katy Perry, Fall Out Boy came back, Justin Timberlake, James Taylor again. They dust him off. Cher, Will.i.am, Jennifer Lopez. I don't think Joe Biden listens to Fall Out Boy and Katy Perry and Justin Timberlake.
Maybe his grandkids.
Maybe
even though, right?
I don't think that's really his thing. That's what was, I guess, exciting about with Clinton and Obama. It seemed like they actually got artists they wanted to be there. Even George W. Bush, I don't think he was a huge Jessica Simpson fan necessarily, but he probably knew it from his daughters.
Sure. And I think, when Biden was elected, obviously this was during COVID. There were some complications with inaugurations around those times, but it seemed like he had his pick of the litter. Everyone was sort of relieved to have the end of the first Trump presidency, even though obviously things have changed now and he was reelected. But at the time, there was a palpable sense of relief. Hollywood was very excited that we were going to have a new chapter and maybe a return to normalcy in our politics. And so a lot of acts came out. I remember there was a bit of a feeding frenzy just to be able to perform.
Right.
Whereas Donald Trump couldn't get Elton John to do it at his first election. So it is interesting. It's the political moment we live in now is very different than any we've seen before. This isn't the first time there's been a big rivalry. Kennedy and Nixon was a big rivalry. Those have existed before, but there was a bit more collegiality. The people who performed at either inauguration could have overlap. It doesn't seem that way anymore.
Bush-Gore was one of the most contentious elections in history, and anybody, I could see 98 Degrees and Jessica Simpson and Destiny's Child performing for Al Gore too.
Right. Let me ask you a question. Do inaugurations have impacts on the charts, or are they sort of a one-off event?
Not really, because a lot of it's not broadcast. It's not like the Super Bowl where tens of millions of people are watching it at once.
Right.
You might see clips online, but do you need? Although I mean, the Village people, it's not their streaming numbers. They have gone up, but iTunes, because Trump does appeal to.
True.
I mean, well, I would say an older audience, but he has a younger vote this time too. But
say TikTok won him the election. So
but I'd say older Trump fans will go to iTunes and buy it, and you see that. So
I was wondering if the sort of, Whitney Houston had her Star Spangled Banner moment at the Super Bowl. That song then charted, correct? Her version of the Star Spangled Banner. Could Carrie Underwood see a moment like that?
She could if she releases it. That's the thing too. You have to release it and put it on streaming. Where you don't have Carrie Underwood singing "America the Beautiful" unless they put this minute-and-a-half long a cappella version on Spotify or Apple Music, and they probably won't.
Probably not. It was a little strange. I'm glad she stepped up and she had what is, I think, a historical moment by doing it a cappella and doing it well, but I don't think it needs to go in the charts.
No, no,
I do want to see.
So.
I wouldn't hate seeing the Village people chart though. There's something infectious and lovable about that group. I know it's all different members. It could crack the top
50 next week. It's possible.
It could, right?
We'll see how much streaming it gets or how big the sales are. But I think looking ahead though, I mean, who knows where we're going to be or what's going to be happening in 2028. But like we were saying, like with Kennedy and Clinton, there was sort of a generational shift. I think we're going to see that. I mean, we've had 80-year-olds, 70, 80-year-olds running the country for a long time.
Yeah.
And J.D. Vance is 39, turning 40 this year.
Younger than us, yes.
As of right now, and again, who knows where we're going to be in 4 years, if he is the Republican nominee, he'll be 43.
Yeah.
I'm sure Democrats will skew much older with their next candidate. AOC will be able to run for president next time. I don't know that she's going to be the nominee, but I'm just saying I think we're going to start seeing millennials start to have more power.
Yeah.
And I think that will be reflected in the next inaugural concert.
Will Lee Greenwood survive it, though? That's the big question. All right, this was fun, Eric. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining me. And we tried to do it with no politics.
We mostly did it.
This is about the music because that is the one thing we can all agree on.
That's it.
No matter how fraught the political times, we love some Destiny's Child and some Village people.
That's it. See you next time.
We'll see you guys next time.